They say power begins in silence, not with a trumpet or sword, but with a slow breath taken before dawn. Long before the empires rose and fell, before banners and borders, there were places where the wind touched nothing but open fields, plains that stretched for miles, rivers that forgot where they started, and people who did not yet think of themselves as rulers. There were hills with no name, and skies no king had ever claimed. But beneath that stillness, something waited. A hunger that had no language. Not ambition yet, just a rhythm. The slow beat of footsteps walking further than before. A child following the edge of the forest. A woman planting beside a stone no one had moved for centuries. Small moments, quiet things, but they became the roots of something larger. Empires are born like this, in forgettable moments. In someone noticing that the earth near the water gives more grain. In a stranger arriving from far away and not leaving. In the way one village begins to envy the peace of another. These were the years when empires had no names, when rulers were still simply the strongest man or the wisest woman, when law was just memory, and memory was passed by breath. They shared stories by firelight, under stars they believed never changed. But the world was already shifting. Slowly, softly, as all great things do at first. In Anatolia, small clusters of homes began to gather around wells. In Nubia, rock-cut tombs appeared long before kingdoms were spoken of. In the river valleys of what is now Pakistan, bricks began to form strange, careful shapes. There was no thunder yet, no conquest, but there was preparation. People were building more than homes. They were building memory, roads made of footsteps, worn paths between fields. Tools passed down not just for farming, but for shaping clay into meaning. They drew lines in the dirt, not for beauty, but to mark where one field ended and another began. Soon, these lines would become borders, and borders would become something to die for, but not yet. For now, they were only warnings, a whisper. This is mine. And even then, ownership was still soft. Still spoken, not enforced. Still fragile enough to be changed by a drought, a birth, or a stranger's kindness. But every quiet empire begins this way. Not with pride, but with caution. Not with gold, but with grain. And always, always with silence. There were places where people didn't know they were building futures. They just knew the winters were cold, and the soil was better near the bend in the river. They built with whatever they had. Bone, mud, hope. Sometimes they shaped small gods from clay and left them at the base of a tree. Sometimes they carved signs into stone that no one would read again for thousands of years. We walk by their ruins now and forget they were once alive, that they held hands, that they whispered to children, that they feared the night too. But they lived. And more than that, they prepared the ground for what came next. Before kings wore crowns, they walked barefoot. Before cities had gates, they were only fire circles under the stars. And before war had a name, people simply fought because they were afraid. These were the first empires, not written in stone, but held in the rhythm of daily life. A rhythm we have never truly lost. Before we go deeper into their stories, we want you to know something. We truly love and care for you. Your presence here, your attention, your time, it means something. So before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. It begins not with violence, but with a question. Why do they have more than us? Why is their grain heavier? Their cattle stronger, their children fatter in the spring. In the distance, their rooftops catch the light differently. Their wells are deeper. Their songs are louder. And though the sky remains the same above both lands, a silence grows in between. It isn't envy at first, but uncertainty. A soft fracture in the old peace. Neighbors who once shared salt now begin to keep more for themselves. The ancient paths between villages, once walked without thought, become slower. people speak more carefully. The earth is still calm, but something beneath it is shifting. These are the fault lines that never make it into textbooks. Not wars, not treaties, just small choices. One family refuses to trade. One man begins to carry a knife he never needed before. One mother prays with her back to the mountain, though she used to face it. Even the animals feel it. The dogs bark longer at night. The oxen startle at shadows. In gardens, voices drop lower. Children are told to stay near the home. These are the signs of early tension. No blood. Not yet. Just the heavy quiet before the old trust begins to decay. Far away in another valley, a different people prepare their fields in the same sun. But their words for water are older, and their gods wear unfamiliar shapes. Their houses lean slightly to the west. Their tools leave different patterns in the soil. The differences are small, but they matter. Because as populations grow, so does memory. And memory is dangerous. People begin to remember past insults, past favors, past debts. A traveler speaks of a cousin killed years ago, and the story spreads like smoke. A song returns, one that hasn't been sung since the last time the river dried. These things do not start fights, but they carry weight. The kind of weight that changes how a person speaks, how they offer bread, how quickly they close the door at dusk. Power begins to organize itself. Elders speak more often. Disagreements take longer to resolve. Someone suggests a wall. Just for protection, they say. Just in case. Walls never come without suspicion. They are built with stone and fear. But even before the stones are laid, the idea begins to settle into people's minds. United States. Them. Ours. Theirs. And once those words are spoken, they are hard to take back. Across the mountains, another people whisper the same things. They too feel the pressure. A narrowing of options. A feeling that their way of life must be guarded now. That if they do not hold on tightly, something will slip away. So it begins. Not with swords, but with soft lines drawn in the dirt. A fence here, a ditch there. Watchmen are posted. Not soldiers, just men with tired eyes and long memories. The first deaths are not in battle. They happen in disputes over water, over marriage, over trees cut without permission. And each time it happens, someone says it was an accident, a misunderstanding. But inside, everyone knows it isn't. The old peace is gone, and what replaces it is not yet war, but something colder. A kind of vigilance. Children are told new rules. Elders begin to speak more of history than of crops. Trade slows, letters stop. The shared festivals, once celebrated together, are now held apart. Same fires, different prayers, and all the while, something gathers in the hearts of men and women. A pressure, a weariness, and under it all, a question that no one speaks aloud. What are we willing to lose to protect what's ours? Some say it won't come to war. That peace always finds a way back. But others no longer believe that. They have seen how fast strangers become threats, how easily a handshake becomes a shield, and how silence, once a sign of harmony, becomes a warning. In the cities that are now dust, in regions whose names are buried beneath new alphabets, these early tensions shaped everything that followed. The people of Sumer, the rulers of Elam, the merchants of Akkad, they all knew the feeling of unease. Their walls still stand in pieces, not because they fell to time, but because they were once raised against those who looked too long across the plain. What began as cooperation turned to calculation, and then suspicion, and then planning. The grain was still harvested, the river still ran, but the hearts of men changed, and when hearts change, the world follows. These were the years when fault lines turned to fissures. Not sudden, not sharp, just slow, like water wearing stone. Kings rose not because they were brave, but because people needed someone to carry the weight of fear. Soldiers trained not for conquest, but because their fathers no longer trusted the morning. Walls were painted with symbols, names of gods who would protect them, marks of power, marks of warning. But no symbol can keep out memory. And memory was now full of shadows. A wedding taken as insult, a tax seen as theft, a gesture mistaken. These were not mistakes. They were symptoms. The body of the empire had begun to tense, and soon it would move. By the time the first true conflicts began, the people no longer saw themselves as neighbors. They had become nations in their own minds. The language shifted. Words for family became words for border. The rivers that once united now divided. And the maps, still drawn by hand, began to shrink. Not in size, but in generosity. Each land seemed smaller, more crowded, more fragile. Leaders who once governed with open arms began to speak of vigilance, of purity, of destiny. And though the people still worked the fields, still kissed their children goodnight, the world around them was no longer the same. Even peace became a weapon, an argument, a threat. To be peaceful was to be weak. To trade was to risk betrayal. Every gesture was interpreted. Every silence was suspicious. And so, slowly, they armed themselves. Not just with bronze and spear, but with history. With stories that justified hate. With ancient wrongs brought back into daylight. And when the drums of war finally sounded, they were not sudden. They were expected. Welcomed, even. Because by then, the idea of the other had become unbearable. War was no longer a tragedy. It was a release. The final act of a story written by too many hands, over too many years. No one remembered when it truly began, only that it had taken too long to come. It began without ceremony. The first flames of conflict did not roar across the earth like thunder. They flickered instead, small, sharp, barely seen from a distance. A soldier missing from a watchpost. A merchant's son not returning from a foreign town. A shepherd found face down in a shallow stream. The signs were scattered and unclear, but to those who watched closely, they meant only one thing, that something old had broken, and something far more dangerous had begun to stir. In Mesopotamia, a silent morning passed where envoys should have met but never did. In Egypt, a guard was posted at the mouth of a canal once considered sacred and safe. In the dry heartlands of what is now Iran, horsemen rode faster than usual, not with messages, but with questions. There was no war, not yet, but the old trust had vanished. And without trust, the world reshaped itself into something sharper, more alert, more cruel. The first kingdoms to rise, Lagash, Kish, Uruk, understood that protection was no longer a gift. It was a demand. Soldiers were not ornaments, they became breath. They became necessity. And cities began to see the spaces beyond their walls, not as distant, but as dangerous. The outside world was no longer vast. It was too close, too full, too hungry. 1,000 small wars broke out, not over empires, but over dignity, over roads, over rivers that had changed their course in the night. No empire declared its hatred aloud, but hatred does not need permission to grow. It grows from memory, from the son of a fisherman whose father drowned during a raid, from the wife of a craftsman who sold his tools to pay for armor, from the old men who remembered a time before borders and resented that no one else did. And so the first campaigns began, carefully, cautiously, sometimes disguised as protection, sometimes dressed as retaliation, but always known deep down for what they were, acts of claiming. The Assyrians in the north began to stretch their fingers westward. The Hittites, fierce and full of vision, hardened their horses and polished their wheels. In the Indus, city walls thickened in the night, not because of storms, but because of stories. And across the Mediterranean, ships were built longer and faster, not only for trade, but for speed, for chase, for escape. A tide had shifted, And once it began, it never stopped. Even those who wanted peace found themselves wrapped in armor. Peace became a ghost, an idea for children and poets. The real world had changed. The real world had chosen. When the first blades clashed in full view of the sun, they did not shine. They dulled quickly, bent against bone, splintered against stone. War was never beautiful. It was exhausting, hot, loud, and it smelled of metal and rot. Archers stood for hours with hands trembling from silence. Chariots creaked as they waited to move, horses sniffing the dust, soldiers whispering prayers into their wrists. The first great battles were not won by brilliance. They were survived. They were measured in who lasted longest without blinking. And those who returned did not boast. They stared into firelight with their mouths closed. Not because they were proud, but because they knew what it cost to stand. Even the victorious empires felt no joy. In Hattusa, the streets were quiet after triumph. In Babylon, victory was followed by the building of more prisons. The cost of war was not only bodies, it was softness. It stripped kindness from people's hands. And yet, it spread. Because once a border was breached, every other border became vulnerable. Once a city fell, every city questioned its walls. This was the age when no one felt safe. And when no one feels safe, everyone becomes a soldier. New weapons were forged. Bronze grew sharper, bows pulled harder, and siege methods passed like secrets from one land to another. Empires shared nothing but the art of destruction. What they built with patience, they learned to destroy with speed. But even as conflict expanded, something else deepened too. Memory. Every fire left a shadow, every fallen gate became a story, and people carried those stories with them, in scars, in songs, in warnings. The early empires of Elam, of Mari, of Ebla, each bore wounds they never fully recovered from. Their palaces were swept clean, but their soil remembered blood. Trade resumed, but always with new eyes, eyes that measured, eyes that distrusted. The map of the world was no longer soft. It had been carved, not in stone, but in fear, and that fear shaped every future step. Rulers stopped calling themselves caretakers. They became divine, eternal, chosen, not because they believed it, but because it gave others a reason to obey. If your ruler is a god, you do not question the war. You only bleed more quietly. And so the first flames did not go out. They became embers, spreading beneath every surface. From Carchemish to Susa, from Ugarit to the highlands of Armenia, the smoke never fully cleared. Fields were planted again, but with more space between them. Walls were rebuilt, but taller, colder. Festivals continued, but they were quieter, shorter, more watched. These were the days when the dream of empire became the weight of empire. When victory turned into vigilance, no one trusted peace anymore, and the fire, once feared, became familiar. A tool, a language. The first great armies were now institutions, bureaucracies of death. And every young man knew, even if no one said it aloud, that his life belonged to something larger, something that could send him far from home, to fight for reasons he would never understand. The empires had changed. They no longer feared conflict. They had become it. They were not ruled by men anymore, not truly. They were ruled by momentum, by memory, by the need to never be the next to fall. And beneath all of it, the walls, the swords, the chariots, the drums, lay the same truth, that war, once begun, does not end with victory. It ends with exhaustion. And exhaustion, too, is a kind of peace, but one that must be earned, one battle at a time. Empires move not like sudden storms, but like rivers bending slowly toward the sea. The march of power is measured in footsteps, in the quiet carrying of burdens from one place to another. It is the sound of boots on cracked earth before the clash of swords. Before the banners are lifted, before the drums call the masses, there is the weight of decision. It is carried in the breath of generals who study maps drawn in flickering firelight, in the hands of labourers who build roads that connect distant villages, in the eyes of kings who know their crowns are fragile, made of metal and fear. Across the lands that once held forgotten cities, the ancient plains of Mesopotamia, the rolling hills of Anatolia, the fertile crescent where rivers entwine, power did not burst forth, but flowed. It seeped into every corner. The march was slow, but relentless. It came with the sound of horseshoes against stone, with wheels grinding pathways into the earth, and with the building of walls that cut like scars across the landscape. These walls were not just defense, they were messages. They said, "We are here. We belong. We will not forget." Empires claimed more than land. They claimed memory itself, rewriting it with each brick laid, each border drawn. The roads that carried armies also carried stories. From Ur to Babylon, from Hattusa to Nimrud, these paths traced the veins of empire, pulsing with the steady flow of power. Along them travelled messengers bearing orders that decided lives. They travelled with silver coins and slaves, with merchants and spies, with priests and scholars who whispered prayers for victory and peace. Every stone in these roads was worn by countless feet, some heavy with armour, others light with hope. Roads connected the once scattered tribes and city-states into a larger whole, binding them with commerce and control. But roads are double-edged. They bring goods and ideas, but also armies and destruction. A march of power means carrying not only grain, but fear. Empires marched over broken temples, taking what they needed and leaving behind silence. Some villages were swallowed whole, others became outposts. All were changed, slowly, almost without noticing. The world became smaller with each journey, but also more dangerous. The safety of the village was replaced by the power of the state. And the state demanded loyalty, not just from soldiers, but from farmers, from children, from mothers who whispered names to the stars and prayed their sons would return. Kings sat beneath canopies woven from silk and gold, but their crowns weighed heavier with each conquest. They wore power like a mantle, but it was also a chain. Each new territory added to their realm was a new wound to tend. Empires stretched thin, like leather pulled too tight. Governors were sent to distant lands to hold order, but distance bred doubt. Letters arrived late or not at all. Sometimes, a province declared itself free. Sometimes, a rebellion whispered through the vineyards and olive groves. The march of power was not always forward. It swayed like a tree in wind, bending, breaking, recovering. Empires knew their fragility better than anyone. Some kings tried to bury that knowledge deep, wearing masks of strength. Others made peace with it, building alliances with marriages, with treaties written on fragile parchment. But trust was a rare commodity, and every alliance was shadowed by the question, when will it end? When will the march turn into a retreat? Beneath the triumph, beneath the banners flying high, the march of power carried a quiet loneliness. The loneliness of decisions no one could undo, of promises that could not be kept, of lives that belonged to the state and not to their own. The soldiers who marched were the heartbeats of empire. Their footsteps marked the rhythm of conquest and control. They moved in unison, but each carried a story. A father who missed his child's laughter. A young man who learned to hate the drumbeat of war, even as it became his only friend. The chariots thundered across plains where once only wind had spoken. Spears glistened under suns that never paused. Yet, between battles, the men sat quietly, sharpening blades, staring into embers, remembering homes that felt more distant with each passing day. Their march was not only over land but through time, carrying traditions forward while leaving others behind. Some marched for glory, others for survival, but all marched into uncertainty. Empires demanded more than obedience. They demanded sacrifice. And sacrifice is a slow burn. It wears down even the strongest souls until only a shadow remains. The march of power is a long journey into silence. And when the armies finally stopped, when the dust settled, the land itself remembered. The cracked earth held the shape of wheels. The stones bore the marks of shields. The air still whispered the names of those who walked before. Power had marched, and in its wake, the world was never the same. The crown is not a prize, but a burden, carried through generations like a flame that must not be extinguished. Empires grew, but they also changed. The faces of kings were many. Some remembered for their wisdom, others for cruelty. Yet all were part of the same story. They wore their power like a mask, hiding fears that no one spoke of. Each victory was layered with loss. Each decision carved new fault lines beneath their feet. The empires of Akkad, Assyria, Babylonia, and beyond knew this too well. Their armies spread far, their laws reached wide, but none could hold forever what the march of power demanded. The future was never certain. Every advance invited resistance. Every conquest whispered of rebellion. And so, beneath the fanfare and feast, behind the closed doors of palaces, rulers wrestled with ghosts. Ghosts of fathers who fell too soon. Ghosts of promises made and broken. And sometimes, in the deepest night, they wondered if the cost was worth the crown. But the march could not stop. It was written in the earth, in the rivers and stones, in the silence between heartbeats, because power, once born, never sleeps. The world caught fire not with one great blaze, but with countless sparks that spread across lands and seas. Empires once quiet began to burn from within, their edges ignited by hunger, fear, and the weight of dreams too large to carry. Flames rose over fields where children once played, over cities that dreamed of peace, over rivers that carried fish and stories alike. Smoke curled into the sky like the memories of those who had fallen, memories that refused to fade. The fire was not only in the armies that marched or the weapons that clashed, but in the hearts of those who lived through it, mothers who wrapped cold hands around empty bowls, fathers who returned with eyes hollowed by what they had seen, and the silent watchers who prayed beneath cracked roofs. The sky turned red at dawn and dusk, the sun veiled behind ash and sorrow. Empires stretched their hands desperately, grasping for more land, more power, as if to hold the flames at bay. But fire consumes everything, no matter how tightly one clings. It reveals the fragile bones beneath the grandeur, the cracks beneath the walls, the truth beneath the lies. In cities like Babylon and Thebes, the fires were both literal and unseen. Markets burned, but so did trust. Alliances, once forged with handshakes and promises, were now fragile threads waiting to snap. Neighbors who shared grain began to guard their stores with suspicion. Letters that once carried news of harvests and festivals turned into warnings and threats. Empires fought not only for territory, but for survival, for identity, for the right to be remembered. The sound of flames was mingled with the silence of loss, lost lives, lost futures, lost humanity. Fields lay fallow, not from neglect, but because the hands that worked them were gone or broken. Roads were stained with more than dust. They bore the footprints of those fleeing the fire and those who came to fight it. The world was burning in ways that no stone could hold or scroll could record. It was burning in the eyes of the weary and the songs left unsung. Across the vast lands, women held worlds together amid the fire. They carried water not just for crops, but to soothe fevered bodies. They wrapped children in stories to protect their dreams from the smoke outside. Some learned to wield power in silence, negotiating peace where swords failed. Others kept the fires at bay by keeping home fires burning, a fragile act of hope amid chaos. The faces of these women, often lost to history, carried the weight of what empires could not. Their grief was deep, their courage quiet but fierce. They understood the cost of power more intimately than kings and generals. As armies marched and battles raged, it was in the small acts of care and survival that the true resistance to fire lived. And yet, even these flames of life flickered under the shadow of the greater blaze. Empires that once promised protection became the source of fear. The world seemed to burn not just from war, but from the hunger and despair that war always leaves behind. The sun never fully set on these fires. Days blended into nights, marked by smoke and the distant rumble of marching feet. Empires rose and fell in the heat of these flames. Some swallowed by them, others forged anew. Cities that once stood proud crumbled to ash and memory, while others rose on their ruins, bearing scars that told stories of resilience and ruin. The dance of fire and shadow shaped the land and the people. It taught them what it meant to lose and to hold on, to fight and to forgive, to remember and to forget. And as the smoke cleared, there was a silence, a quiet after the storm that was both an ending and a beginning. The fire had consumed much, but it also revealed what remained. The bones beneath the earth, the seeds in the soil, the stories carried by those who survived. The world on fire was not just destruction, it was transformation. It was the slow burning away of what was, making space for what might come next. And in that space, there was a fragile hope, a hope that one day the fire might rest and the world might find its breath again. War does not only rage on distant fields, it seeps into homes like cold shadows creeping beneath the door. The war at home is quieter, but no less real. It is the absence felt in the empty chair at the family table, the silence in the evening where laughter once lived, the slow folding of letters stained with tears or dirt. Empires stretched their reach far beyond their borders, but the true battles were often fought where no one saw. Palaces gleamed with gold and silk, but inside their walls, peace was a fragile guest. Kings and queens carried heavy crowns made of expectation and loss. Their nights were long, filled with whispered fears and unanswered questions. Sons were sent away before they knew the taste of home, their futures traded like coins in unseen deals. Mothers bore the weight of waiting, threading hope and dread through each passing day. The war at home did not roar like the battlefield. It whispered through the halls, settled in the eyes of the weary, and grew in the hearts of those left behind. It was a war fought in quiet rooms and in the memory of things lost. Fathers who once held tools in steady hands now clenched swords they barely knew how to wield. The call to battle pulled men from the fields and workshops, leaving empty spaces that no harvest or craft could fill. Villages waited for returnees who did not come, or who came broken in body and spirit. The fabric of daily life tore slowly, thread by thread. Children grew up with stories of fathers they barely remembered, with mothers who held onto letters and memories like fragile treasures. Empires demanded sacrifice, but the cost was often invisible in the grand tales of conquest. It lived instead in the lullabies sung softly at night, in the whispered prayers for safety, in the quiet mourning of those who understood too well what was at stake. The war at home was a shadow war, fought with absence and longing, with hope and despair. It shaped the very soul of the empire, just as much as the battles fought beyond the walls. Power weighed heaviest when the world was still. In the deep silence of the night, rulers faced the sharp edges of their choices. They bore the burden of lives entrusted to their command, the futures they could not guarantee. Decisions made in sunlit halls rippled far beyond, touching the lives of strangers and kin alike. A single order might send thousands marching, but the echoes reached even further, into the homes, the hearths, the hearts of all. The weight of rule was loneliness. Crowns were forged in fire but carried in solitude. The war at home was a mirror held up to power, reflecting not glory but cost. It reminded those who ruled that their strength came from fragile human threads: loyalty, love, fear, and memory. And when those threads frayed, even the mightiest empire could unravel from within. Amid the turmoil, some found strength in the smallest acts: a mother sewing a garment from torn cloth, a child tending a wounded animal, a neighbor sharing bread when the granaries ran low. These moments were not recorded on tablets or sung in halls, but they were the quiet resistance to the chaos outside. The war at home was fought as much in these acts of care as in the clash of armies. It was the keeping of light in the darkness, the planting of seeds where fire had scorched. And though the world beyond walls trembled, the human heart beat on, fragile, fierce, and unbroken. Empires were made of stone and blood, but also of these quiet moments. The war at home was a reminder that even in the midst of destruction, life finds a way to endure. Between every great battle, there is a silence. Not peace, not truly, but something softer, stranger, a quiet that lingers over scorched fields and empty roads. In these long pauses, the world holds its breath. Soldiers sharpen blades not from urgency, but from habit. Horses graze near tents that no longer smell of smoke. And the air carries a stillness that feels both holy and haunted. It is the kind of silence that does not forget. It remembers everything. The footsteps of those who no longer walk. The names called out in the dark. The prayers whispered beneath battered shields. This silence moves through camps and cities alike. It seeps into stone and soil, into ruined gates and burned-out homes. It hovers in the pauses between drums, in the spaces between commands. It is where grief takes root. Not the loud grief of mourning, but the quiet grief that sits beneath the ribs and waits. Between battles, the body continues, but the spirit begins to drift. Time stretches thin. Hours feel heavy. The wounded watch the sky with hollow eyes. Farmers return to fields, but they move slower, more careful now, as if the land itself might betray them. And in the temples, priests pray not for victory, but for stillness, for the silence to stay just a little longer. In these spaces, decisions are made that will never be written in stone. A commander walks the edge of a ravine and chooses not to advance. A letter is burned before it can be sent. A daughter is hidden behind high walls. A message is sent by moonlight, promising peace. These are the choices that shape the next war, as though they carry no glory. Empires, too, are quiet in these hours. Kings write fewer decrees. Scribes pause their recordings. Even the markets speak in lower voices. Life resumes, but only in fragments. Bread is baked again, but it tastes different. Songs return, but without joy. The silence between battles teaches people how to move in half steps, how to carry joy and fear in the same basket, how to dance with an ear to the ground. And though it feels like nothing is happening, everything is changing. Children grow older while their fathers are still away. Walls are rebuilt, not stronger, but quieter. Fields are plowed with one hand on a blade. Even laughter sounds different. It is sharper, more brittle, like glass that could crack if held too tightly. But laughter still comes. That is the miracle of this silence. Life continues, bent, bruised, uncertain, but alive. The silence holds things that noise never can. It holds the memory of retreat, of failure, of the moment a city closed its gates too late. It holds the weight of promises made beside the dying. It holds the echo of a mother's voice calling for her son through the dust. These are not stories carved on tablets or woven into royal songs. They are the stories kept inside, passed in glances, in shared breath, in hands held too tightly for too long, and though they may never be spoken aloud, they shape the heart of empire more deeply than any victory. For every war has its aftermath, but few speak of what lives between. Of the soldier who cannot sleep, even on soft ground. Of the boy who plays with a sword made of wood, imitating heroes who never returned, of the woman who walks barefoot to the river each day, searching for something she cannot name. The silence is where war settles after it ends. It is where memory softens into ache, where certainty becomes shadow, and yet, within that ache, something new begins. A kind of knowing, a deeper understanding of what power costs and what it cannot give. Across empires, this silence looked different but felt the same. In the remains of the Mitanni lands, once loud with language and trade, stillness now reigned. In the cities of the Levant, where Phoenician sails had once spread like wings across the sea, docks now stood empty, watching the horizon with suspicion. Even in mighty Egypt, where the Nile flowed endlessly through time, the silence took root in the courts and corridors. Not even gold could shield against it. Rulers spoke less, nobles walked with lowered eyes, soldiers drilled in circles, not for readiness, but for rhythm, to keep their minds from wandering too far back. The silence became a part of them. It was worn like a second skin, both curse and comfort. And though it would eventually break, always, inevitably, it left marks, deep ones. It changed how empires prayed, how they remembered, how they imagined the future. Between the roar of conquest and the scream of collapse, there was always this quiet middle. And it was here, in this fragile space, that the deepest truths of empire were laid bare. That no battle is ever truly won. That no land is ever truly owned. And that the greatest force in history may not be power, but the ability to endure what comes after. There comes a moment in every empire's life when the path forward can no longer continue as it was. A moment that does not look like collapse, but feels like hesitation. Like the brief falter in a step that once seemed sure. These are the turning points. Quiet at first, but heavy. And around them are the broken promises, not always spoken, but felt. In the way a ruler says soon and never returns. In the way a village sends its grain and receives no soldiers when the bandits arrive. In the way treaties are signed and sealed, only to vanish in the smoke of betrayal. The world does not split in half when these moments come. It simply bends. Gently at first, and then with weight, and then with pain. And in that bending, the nature of empire is revealed. Power does not hold steady. It sways, it doubts, it hesitates. One decision made in haste echoes through years of struggle. One silence kept too long unravels the bond between king and kin. And suddenly, a place that felt eternal begins to feel exposed. These turning points live inside forgotten letters and empty chairs. They live in stories children overhear but do not yet understand. They live in roads no longer guarded, and in banners lowered just slightly too soon. In the Hittite Empire, it was the weight of promises that cracked first. Grain shipments delayed, border alliances strained, envoys that never returned. The king in Hattusa wrote to his allies in words full of hope, but behind the script, there was a weariness that no ink could hide. His words carried the shape of apology, even as they spoke of strength. He knew what was slipping. The enemies at the edge of the map were not the true danger. It was the forgetting that hurt most. That people no longer believed in the center. That the crown no longer shone in their imagination. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the twilight of the new kingdom was setting slowly. Pharaohs still wore gold, still walked through temples painted in ochre and blue, but the lands beyond the delta were restless. Vassals rebelled in hushed tones. Distant territories whispered about independence, about fate, about old gods rising again. The turning point here was not a single rebellion or a failed campaign. It was in the rhythm of the river itself, still flowing, still beautiful, but no longer feared. The world had learned how to live without needing the empire. That was the betrayal no army could mend. The Assyrians, fierce and clever, sensed their moment coming too. Their victories had carved deep scars across the map, but even steel bends under time. The turning point came not when a battle was lost, but when it was not worth fighting. When the prize no longer justified the price, they had stretched too far. Even iron grows tired. Roads could not carry orders fast enough. Governors ruled more for themselves than for the king. The people prayed, but not for glory anymore. They prayed for rain, for calm, for an end to conscription. And in the east, in the high valleys where the Elamites had once sung their own songs, silence became a kind of resistance. The world was turning, and not toward empire, but away. These shifts were not sudden. They passed like shadows at dusk, slow and full of doubt. But those who watched closely knew. This was the sound of something once mighty learning how to fracture. The weight of promises, once sacred, now fell empty on the floor. It was not just rulers breaking trust. It was the very idea of empire learning its own limits. In the marketplaces of Ugarit and Byblos, traders looked up from their ledgers and saw fewer ships than the year before. The ports were still busy, but the eyes behind the stalls had changed. More cautious, more guarded. Messages arrived slower. Coins carried new faces. The sea no longer promised safety, only distance. Farther west, on the edges of the world the old powers barely knew, new voices were rising. Small cities that had once bowed to greater thrones began to speak their own names. The turning point here was made of courage, not collapse. Of younger generations asking why they must bow at all. Why their grain must feed someone else's army. Why their sons must wear someone else's armor. In this quiet defiance, a new map began to form. Not drawn by scribes, but by choices. Families choosing to stay when they were told to move. Merchants choosing to trade outside the empire's reach. Words spoken in local tongues, without apology. These moments were not revolutions. They were revelations. That the center no longer held the future. That the future might grow from the edges, in places where the fire had not yet burned. But even in decline, empires dream. They do not fade without vision. They build more monuments. They declare more victories. They rewrite the past with golden ink. They try to freeze time in marble and decree. Yet history does not pause, and no promise can hold forever against the pull of change. The broken promises of empire echo in strange ways. In lost scrolls, in broken statues, in temples that echo with empty songs. In the quiet refusal of a city to send tribute. In the lone rider who takes the long road home instead of delivering the message. These moments do not fill the pages of history, but they shape it. Because the end of empire is not always fire and ash. Sometimes it is simply forgetting. A slow loosening of the thread. A fading of the drumbeat. A generation born that no longer remembers why the crown mattered. And in that forgetting, something else is born. A chance to begin again. Not with gold or glory, but with humility. With soil and hands and stories that do not need to be written in stone. The tide does not turn with thunder. It turns with a whisper. With a ripple beneath a still water. With footsteps that grow quieter, not louder. The decline of empire is not a fall. It is a drift. A long, slow yielding to time, to pressure, to the small cracks that no one thought would matter. Across the lands that had once been firelit with ambition, the weight of centuries began to press down. Roads once crowded grew dusty. The songs of power still echoed, but they echoed into smaller rooms. The great names, Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, still sat on thrones, but the thrones had aged. Their shadows were long, but their roots had thinned. The world did not rebel all at once. It simply changed direction. Grain moved differently through the ports. Letters arrived later, or not at all. Tribute shrank. Borders blurred. But no horn was sounded. No line was drawn in the dust. Only the slow realization that the tide had begun to shift. The sea that once carried empire forward now tugged gently, persistently, in the other direction. Kings looked out from their palaces and saw the same hills, the same rivers. But the feeling had changed. The land did not listen the way it used to. In this soft turning, memory became dangerous. The memory of how it once was, of armies welcomed, with garlands, of maps stretched wide and confident, became a kind of ache. The ache of longing, of comparison. Rulers spoke of former glory more often than of present strength. Statues were repaired. Temples were scrubbed clean. Ceremonies grew longer, more ornate. But beneath the gold, there was doubt. Beneath the incense, there was fear. The people knew, even if they said nothing. They saw how the soldiers were younger now, less trained. They saw how coins were smaller, lighter, not the same silver they once knew. They noticed the old roads falling into disrepair, the merchants choosing other routes. These were not rebellions. They were refusals. A quiet unbinding of trust. The empire had not collapsed. It had loosened. And with each loosened thread, the structure lost a little more of itself. Not loudly, but irrevocably. The tide had changed, and though many still lived as if it had not, the current pulled beneath them. In the east, new voices were rising. Persia watched from the highlands, silent and watchful. Their eyes were sharp, their memory long. They had not forgotten the lessons of other empires. And as the tide pulled back from the old powers, the Persians prepared to step forward, not in haste, but in rhythm with the turning world. Meanwhile, in the west, smaller states that had once bent the knee began to find their own shapes. Some looked inward, others reached outward. The Greeks, still fractured and often feuding, felt something stir beneath their city-states. A sense that the story no longer belonged only to the old centers. Even in distant lands, places not yet written into the empire's scrolls, new forms of life were taking root. The tide was not only receding, it was carrying seeds to new shores, and those seeds would grow. But for now, the silence remained. A lull between what had been and what would be. The great empires still stood, but they were standing in shadows. They were moving with the slow dignity of old giants who know that strength cannot turn back the sea. The people continued their lives as they always had. Wheat still rose from the soil. Mothers still sang at dusk. Festivals still lit up the night. But even joy had changed its tone. It was quieter, more precious. Laughter came more easily among the poor than the powerful. Power had grown heavy. It required explanation. An explanation, too often, is a sign of doubt. Across Babylon, scribes wrote laws that no longer carried fear. Across Egypt, priests sang to gods who no longer answered with floods on time. Across what remained of Hittite lands, the once great archives fell silent, their tablets left unfinished. The tide had not destroyed these places. It had emptied them. Slowly, with grace even, as if time itself had grown gentle in its passing. But gentleness can be final. The wind does not return old leaves to the branch. It carries them away. In this way, the world began to look elsewhere. The memory of empire lingered, but it was no longer enough. People needed something else, and they began, quietly, to find it in themselves, in villages untouched by decree, in stories unrecorded by scribes, in freedoms no longer borrowed, but made. What came next would be new, shaped by what had come before, but not beholden to it. The tide had changed slowly, but completely. And though the empires might still raise their flags, might still call themselves eternal, the world no longer believed them. Belief had moved. It had settled into humbler places, into hands calloused not by war but by work, into voices not praised by kings but listened to by neighbors. The center no longer held the power it claimed. It held only memory, and memory is not command. It is echo, a reminder, a hope perhaps, but not control. So the tide turned, not with fire, not with fanfare, but with the steady quiet of things that know how to leave. Not all empires end with one great fall. Most begin to die in pieces. A wall left unrepaired, a tax left unpaid, a soldier who never returns. The collapse does not come with a single roar, but with 1,000 small defeats, so quiet, so ordinary that no one calls them defeat at all. A village refuses a census. A local governor keeps more grain than he reports. A road floods and no one clears the debris. These things do not make the scrolls. They do not reach the king. But they shape the world beneath the throne. Over time, these quiet acts of disobedience, these small withdrawals from the center, begin to hollow out the power that once felt unshakable. Across Assyria, officials still spoke with force, but their eyes told a different story. They knew the weight of what was slipping. They knew the border towns no longer sent their full tribute. That local temples burned offerings not to the king's gods, but to older, quieter spirits. That the merchants passed through, but they no longer lingered. And in Egypt, long past the height of His Majesty, the Nile still flooded, but no longer seemed to bless. The palaces were large, but the halls felt cold. The silence in the court was not reverent, it was waiting. These were not the defeats of war, but the defeats of indifference, of weariness, of memory growing thin. In Babylon, the record still called it a golden age, but the golden thread had frayed. The scribes knew their ink would not last. The children learned the names of kings, but their eyes drifted toward other tales, not of conquest, but of survival. And still, life continued. That was the quiet tragedy of these small defeats. The world did not stop. It simply changed. A farmer planted fewer rows, a trader avoided certain routes, a healer whispered old remedies no longer approved by the crown, and in the hills, where empire's voice arrived last, people began to live as if it no longer mattered. They did not rebel. They simply ceased to wait, ceased to ask, ceased to remember what the empire had promised. These were the cracks that no one sealed, the threads no one mended, the edges no one noticed were curling into ash, and still, the capitals lit their fires. Still, the priests sang. Still, the generals trained their men. But the ground beneath them was shifting. There were no banners to mark these losses, no drums to mourn them. But they gathered all the same. One family moves away from a town and never sends word. One outpost sends for aid and receives none. One law is passed and quietly ignored. And the empire continues, but it is lighter, emptier. Its weight no longer felt the same. The people still bowed, but not with belief. The officials still collected, but not with pride. Even among the rulers, there was a softness in the voice, a glance toward the past that lasted too long. They spoke of strength, but they clutched it too tightly. That is what 1,000 small defeats do. They take not the crown, but the confidence. Not the city, but the spirit. The outer form remains, but the center hollows. In distant provinces, rebels rose, not always with swords, but with silence, with refusals, with a turning away. Some places simply stopped answering the empire's voice. Others began to speak in new ones. And through it all, the empire told itself the same story. That it was still whole. That it was still chosen. That it was still strong. The truth was quieter. It lived in the grain that no longer flowed toward the capital. In the songs that no longer praised the king. In the coins that bore faces no one recognized. In the soldiers who served more for pay than for loyalty. In the roads too dangerous to walk at night. These were the 1,000 small defeats, each one a thread pulled gently from the tapestry. Not enough to tear it, not yet, but enough to loosen it, to make it less sure, to make it tremble in the wind. And still, the fires burned in the temples. Still, the rituals continued. Still, the maps were drawn with wide, proud borders. But those borders were illusions. On the ground, things were shifting. Slowly. Steadily. Beyond the reach of orders. And in that shifting, a question grew, not spoken, but felt. Not by the kings, but by the people. What holds us together now? Is it law? Is it fear? Is it habit? Or is it something already gone? And as that question moved silently through the streets and fields, through the marketplaces and farms, the Empire found itself staring at its own reflection, unchanged on the surface but no longer whole beneath. It had not been conquered. It had not fallen. But it had faded, bit by bit, not with a scream, but with a sigh. When empires begin to slip beyond repair, they often do not yield with grace. They fight. Not because there's hope of return, but because the memory of power is hard to surrender. And so the final offensives begin, not out of confidence, but fear. They are louder than those that came before, braver perhaps, but also desperate. These are the last surges of strength from arms that have forgotten how to rest. Across the lands of the old Near East, campaigns were mounted with the hollow energy of a dream trying not to end. Kings who had once ruled calmly now called for war with urgency. Borders were redrawn, but the ink was dry before the map could settle. In Assyria, the mightiest of the warrior states, armies still thundered outward, their iron weapons flashing, their chariots grinding the earth. But behind every campaign was a breathlessness. Victories were no longer decisive. Each one led to another need, another risk. Cities that had been taken were soon taken back. Allies faltered. Supplies thinned. Roads cracked under the weight of overuse. Even the soldiers knew. Their songs, once proud and defiant, grew quiet by the fireside. Some no longer sang at all. In the halls of Nineveh, orders were still shouted, scrolls still sealed, sacrifices still made. But behind every ritual, there was something else. A sense of fragility, of time running out. Assyria had been the anvil of empire, feared across the world. But now its edges dulled. Babylon, once its rival and then its vassal, began to stir again. Not with great force at first, but with resolve. The Babylonians saw the faltering of their old overlords and began to remember themselves. They saw the cracks not as disaster, but as invitation. Nabopolassar, rising from obscurity, would soon lead them with steady eyes and a firm hand. Not because the world needed a new empire, but because the old one had opened its gates too wide. Elsewhere, the Medes, mountain people once dismissed, gathered strength in the silence left by others. They watched, waited. They knew that the final offensives of Assyria would tire it, hollow it, leave it exposed. In this moment of overreach, they moved. The final battles came quickly, then slowly, then all at once. Ashurbanipal's campaigns had once reached as far as Thebes in Egypt, the furthest the Assyrians would ever go. But after him, the throne changed hands with unease. Generals became kings, brothers turned on each other, cities burned without purpose. The empire still roared, but its roar was thinner now, carried more by memory than might. Each new enemy felt familiar. Each new rebellion had the shape of those already crushed. But now, the crushing took longer, cost more, and some would not stay crushed at all. The Babylonians and Medes joined hands beneath the old stars and moved eastward like a tide returning. In 612 BCE, Nineveh, the mighty, the shining, the feared, fell. Its palaces were broken, its libraries scattered, its streets, once so full of command, ran quiet. The empire of Assyria did not end in one day, but that day marked the beginning of its silence. And silence, for a power built on voice and terror, was final. Even after Nineveh fell, the fight did not stop. Some Assyrian generals fled west to Haran and tried to continue the dream. Egypt, ever watchful, sent support. But these were shadows, flickers of Resistance from an empire already laid bare. The final offensives continued like breath in a dying body, mechanical, instinctive, unable to stop. But the world had moved on. The rivers no longer carried fear. The roads no longer led only to the throne. In the new capitals, power began to speak a different tongue. The Babylonians rebuilt with care, remembering their own past, shaping something softer. The Medes carved out their place in the mountains, strong and still. Even the Persians, still waiting in the wings, began to imagine a world not ruled by terror, but by roads, by systems, by vision. The final offensives of the old world had taught them what not to do. They had shown that even fear has a limit, that no army can march forever, that people do not forget who made them bleed. And so the empires that came after were built differently, not kinder, always, but broader, more flexible, wiser in their cruelty, less certain in their strength. Assyria faded into dust, into legend, into stone reliefs half buried by sand. But it left behind a lesson, that the strongest sword still dulls, that the loudest throne still quiets, that the final offensive is not only a military act, it is emotional, a refusal to admit the end, a longing so great it disguises itself as strength. But longing is not a foundation, and grief is not governance. And so the final flames flickered, and the resolve that once lit up continents grew dim. The soldiers laid down their arms. The walls no longer echoed with orders. And somewhere beyond the ruins, a shepherd led his flock past broken idols and whispered a song to the wind, a song that asked no permission and carried no flag. It was not empire. It was peace. Empires do not fall all at once. They unravel slowly, like threads pulled from a woven cloth, until the whole begins to fray. The collapse is not sudden thunder, but a drawn-out silence that settles over cities and fields alike. Walls that once held proud banners stand cracked and empty. Roads once travelled by caravans grow wild with grass and dust. The sound of hammers fades, replaced by the quiet sighs of those who remain. People move differently now, more cautiously, with eyes turned inward. They carry the weight of loss not just in their bodies, but in their spirits. The consequences of collapse spread like ripples in a still pond, reaching far beyond the crumbled stones. They touch those who did not fight, who did not choose sides, but who lived through the trembling of the earth beneath their feet. Markets close, but the hunger lingers. Temples stand silent, but the prayers echo faintly in the wind. The end of empire is not a single moment, but a long, slow unspooling of all that was held together. It is the breaking of trust between rulers and ruled, the fading of laws once obeyed, the forgetting of oaths once sworn. In the aftermath, some cling to memory like a lifeline. They tell stories of kings and gods, of victories and justice, as if speaking. These names aloud might summon back what has been lost, but memory is fragile. It bends under the weight of time and trauma. The broken faces of statues become shadows in the dusk. Scrolls rot in forgotten libraries, their words swallowed by silence. Children grow up knowing only the echoes of empires, not their voices. The landscape changes too. Rivers shift course, forests reclaim fields. The soil holds the bones of battles, but also of those who simply lived and died in quiet corners. The collapse touches every life differently. Some lose everything at once, others see their world shrink little by little. And all carry the consequences forward, like an unseen scar beneath the skin. Some places fall faster than others. The cities at the edges, once bustling with trade and culture, become empty shells. Walls crumble under the weight of neglect. Temples are stripped of offerings. The great halls are left to the wind and the birds. In these places, collapse is a slow erasure, but elsewhere, life continues. Farms still produce grain, families still gather for festivals, rivers still flow. Yet, even where life goes on, it does so in the shadow of what has been lost. Trust is harder to find. The stories told by elders are tinged with sadness and warning. The land feels heavier, as if it remembers. The people speak less of empire and more of survival. Their eyes watch the horizon, wary of what might come next. Collapse is not just an end. It is the uncertain space before something else begins. It is the silence after the storm, filled with both fear and fragile hope. The consequences of collapse are not only material, they are emotional and spiritual. Fear spreads like wildfire. Communities that once stood together fracture under pressure. Old alliances break. New enemies emerge. The dreams that fueled expansion turn into nightmares of loss. People grieve not only for those who died, but for the future that will never come. The sky feels lower, the nights longer, and yet, in this darkness, some find light. In the ruins, seeds are planted. In the silence, new voices rise. Children born in the shadow of collapse learn to ask different questions. They do not ask how to conquer, but how to rebuild. How to remember without being trapped by memory. How to hold on to hope when the past is full of pain. These are the seeds of renewal, small and fragile but persistent. They grow slowly, quietly, like grass through cracked stone. The consequences ripple beyond the fallen walls. Neighboring lands watch with mixed fear and opportunity. Some send aid, others send armies. The vacuum left by a collapsing empire invites change. New powers rise to claim what was left behind, but they too inherit the weight of collapse. They learn that power is fleeting, that control is always contested. They discover that empires, no matter how mighty, are built on fragile foundations of trust and fear. The lessons of collapse become part of their own stories, woven into the fabric of their reigns. Sometimes these lessons are forgotten until it is too late. Sometimes they are remembered, but ignored. And still, the cycle turns. Collapse is a reminder of the cost of power, of how even the greatest kingdoms can crumble beneath the weight of ambition, greed, and silence. It is a story of endings, but also beginnings, of loss, but also of resilience, of death, but also of life. The ruins left behind are not just monuments to failure, but markers of what once was and what might be again. The consequences of collapse echo in every stone, every river, every whispered story passed down through generations. They ask us to remember that power is never permanent, that history is shaped as much by what is lost as by what is won. And in that remembering, there is a kind of peace, a quiet acceptance of the impermanence of all things. Memory is a heavy thing. It weighs on the shoulders of those who carry it, shapes the paths they walk, and colors the stories they tell. After an empire falls, memory becomes both a gift and a burden. It is a light in the dark, guiding those who remain through the shadows of loss and change. Yet it is also a chain, binding people to what once was, making it difficult to move forward. The price of memory is paid in silence and sorrow, in the spaces where joy once lived but no longer can. It lives in the faces of elders who speak in whispers, in the careful retelling of ancient battles and lost cities. It is found in the cracked walls of abandoned palaces and the faded colors of temple murals. Memory is the thread that connects past to present, but it is a thread worn thin by time and pain. Empires survive in memory long after their stones have crumbled. Their stories become legends, their kings become gods, their defeats become warnings. Yet memory is not always kind. It can twist the truth, hiding wounds beneath layers of myth. It can create heroes where there were none, or erase those who did not fit the story. The price of memory is distortion, the slow reshaping of history to fit the needs of those who remember. In Babylon, for example, the destruction wrought by war was retold as the triumph of order over chaos, even as the city lay in ruins. In Egypt, the great pharaohs were remembered for their glory while the struggles of the people were left unspoken. Memory chooses what to hold and what to forget, and in doing so, it shapes the future as much as the past. The cost of holding memory is often paid by the living. Families pass down tales of ancestors, but those stories can carry sorrow as well as pride. The weight of memory can cause divisions as much as unity. Some hold on tightly, unwilling to let go of what was lost. Others seek to bury the past, hoping to escape its pain. Between these two, communities can fracture. The price of memory is the tension between remembrance and forgetting. It asks hard questions. How much of the past should be carried forward? How much should be left behind? And who gets to decide? These questions shape the identity of nations and peoples long after the empires themselves have vanished. Memory is also a place of healing. It allows people to grieve what has been lost, to honor those who suffered, and to find meaning in destruction. Monuments are built not only to celebrate, but to remember the cost of power. Rituals and ceremonies are held to keep the past alive, to teach the young, and to preserve connection. Yet these acts of remembering can sometimes become prisons, locking people into cycles of resentment or nostalgia. The price of memory is that it can hold people captive as much as it frees them. It requires courage to remember without being trapped by the past, to carry memory lightly enough to move forward. This balance is difficult and rare, but it is where resilience grows. Across the lands that once belonged to great empires, memory takes many forms. In the stories told around fires, in the songs sung softly in the night, in the ruins that stand as silent witnesses. These memories are not just about kings and battles. They are about everyday lives, loves, and losses. They are the memories of those who built walls and tended fields, who raised children and buried the dead. The price of memory is the recognition that history is not only made by the powerful, but by all who live through it. And in this recognition, memory becomes a bridge, connecting past and present, pain and hope, loss and renewal. Memory can also be a warning. It reminds those who come after that power is fragile, that empires rise and fall, that glory is fleeting. It teaches humility to those who would rule, patience to those who wait, and courage to those who rebuild. The price of memory is the acceptance of impermanence, the understanding that all things change and fade. It is a lesson written not in stone, but in the hearts of those who listen. Memory asks us to see beyond the surface, to hear the silence beneath the noise, to honor the cost of history without being consumed by it. In the end, memory is both burden and gift. It carries the weight of the past, but also the possibility of the future. It is the quiet voice that whispers in the night, reminding us of who we were, who we are, and who we might become. The price of memory is never easy to pay, but it is the price that shapes the soul of humanity. Through memory, empires live again, not in power or conquest, but in the stories that connect us all across time and space. And in these stories, there is both loss and hope, sorrow and strength, an unbroken thread that carries us forward into the unknown. After the fire, there is a silence that holds its own meaning. It is not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something transformed. The blazing flames that once consumed cities and kingdoms give way to ash. And from that ash, the earth breathes again. What remains after the fire is not just ruin, but possibility. Stones lie scattered, their edges softened by wind and time, and in the spaces between, new roots take hold. The bones of once mighty empires rest beneath the soil, reminders of what was, and warnings of what might come. Yet the world does not stop here. The story does not end with smoke and collapse. Instead, it turns quietly toward what grows next, shaped by the echoes left behind and the memories carried forward. What remains is both absence and presence, loss and beginning, a fragile balance between remembering and forgetting. It is in this space that life persists, quietly insisting on continuity despite all odds. The ruins stand as monuments, not only to power but to its impermanence. They are witnesses to the hopes and fears, the triumphs and failures of those who built them. The cracked walls and fallen columns hold stories, whispered by the wind, stories of laughter and tears, of kings and commoners, of peace and war. Travelers pass through these remnants, often unaware of the layers beneath their feet, the centuries folded into every stone. Yet even in silence, these places speak. They remind us that empires are human creations, fragile and fleeting, subject to the same forces that shape all life. What remains after the fire is a testament to resilience, the resilience of the land that reclaims, the people who endure, and the memory that lingers. In the years and centuries that follow, the landscapes once ruled by empires become home to new cultures and peoples. They build their lives atop the echoes of the past, sometimes honoring, sometimes ignoring what came before. New languages rise, new beliefs take root, new stories unfold. Yet the shadow of the old empires never fully disappears. It lives in the names of rivers and mountains, in the customs adapted and preserved, in the art and architecture inspired by distant memories. The fire has passed, but its light continues to cast long shadows, shaping identity in subtle, profound ways. What remains is a layered history, a tapestry woven from the threads of many lives and many times, where endings and beginnings intertwine. The earth itself holds the marks of empire and fire. Archaeologists uncover cities buried beneath sand and soil, revealing glimpses of lives long gone. Pottery shards, tools, and bones tell stories of daily existence, the rhythms of work and rest, celebration and mourning. These fragments, though silent, give voice to those lost to history's grand narratives. They remind us that behind every empire lie countless individuals whose lives matter deeply, even if their names are forgotten. What remains after the fire is not only the ruins of stone, but the invisible lives etched into the land, the traces of humanity that endure beyond power and conquest. Memory, too, survives the fire, though it changes shape. It becomes myth, legend, and sometimes cautionary tale. The lessons of fallen empires are passed down in parables and songs, teaching future generations about the costs of pride, greed, and neglect. Yet memory is also a source of hope, a reminder that destruction is not the end of all things. From the ashes, new dreams arise, new communities form, new possibilities unfold. What remains after the fire is the potential for renewal, the quiet insistence that life continues, even after loss. It is a delicate promise whispered through time, urging us to listen and to learn. The legacy of these empires, their rise and fall, invites reflection on the nature of power itself. Power is not static or eternal. It is a current that flows through time, shaped by human hands and hearts. What remains after the fire challenges us to reconsider what truly endures. The stones or the stories, the armies or the people, the conquests or the connections. It asks us to see beyond the grandeur of empire to the human cost beneath, to honor the lives lived in the shadow of kings and battles. In this reflection lies a profound humility, an acknowledgement of our place within a vast unfolding history that stretches beyond any one reign or realm. As the world turns, the ruins become part of the landscape of memory and meaning. They are places where history and present meet, where silence invites contemplation. What remains after the fire is an invitation to listen to the past without being trapped by it, to carry memory with care, to build futures informed by wisdom and compassion. These remnants remind us that every empire, no matter how mighty, is temporary, but the human spirit endures. In the quiet spaces after the flame, we find not only the shadows of what was lost, but the seeds of what might be.